Hi, this is Robin Padgey, and today we're talking about communication, what you need to know to get what you need. The reason we communicate is to get our needs met, although a lot of us communicate in a way that prevents people from wanting to meet our needs. So today's objective is to talk about the things that we do when we communicate that might be preventing us from getting our desired response. George Bernard Shaw said the biggest problem with communication is the illusion we have achieved it. All too often, we think that when we're communicating with people, we're on the same page. We even ask them, do you understand? And normally they nod their head and say, yes, they do. Do they have any questions? And frequently they shake their head and say, no, they don't. And then off they go, thinking they understand what we've said. And we think they understand what we've said. Only then we find out that we have a misunderstanding because they don't give us the results that we want. And so what we're going to discuss today is not only what you might be doing to prevent yourself from getting the results that you want, but also to ensure that people understand what you are saying to them. Here's the definition of communication. When the sender of the message and the receiver of the message have the same understanding of the message. And it seems like it should be easy, especially if people are speaking the same language. We use simple words. We know what we mean to say, and people indicate that they understand what we said, only we don't have mutual understanding. And again, we don't find out until later. So here's an example that I'll give you. My husband and I had an old dog named Roscoe, and toward the end of his life, he couldn't always make it out the doggy door to do his business. And sometimes our bedroom carpet was the recipient of his business. And so after we would clean up, my husband and I would agree after Roscoe dies, we're getting a new carpet. That was a very simple understanding, I thought. And so Roscoe died on a Saturday. The following Monday, I was at the carpet store choosing carpet samples. I brought them home. My husband indicated which sample he liked, and I'm off to call the carpet people to get a new carpet installed. He said, wait a minute, what are you doing? I'm getting our new carpet installed. He said, I'm not ready to get a new carpet yet. And I said, but we agreed after Roscoe died, we're getting a new carpet. Roscoe died, this is after. He said, no, I'm not going to get a new carpet for another year or so because we've got things to do on that bedroom and it doesn't make sense to get a new carpet before we make those changes. Well, he'd never told me that that was his intention, and so we had a bit of a conflict. We had different definitions of what the word after meant. And so, yes, it did cause conflict. Have we gotten a new carpet? No. And Roscoe died 5 years ago. So hopefully after will come soon. So why do we communicate? Well, for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is that we live in a society and we have to communicate in order to get things done. Another reason is for health reasons. We need to communicate in order to remain healthy. There's a great commercial on TV right now that encourages people to talk to their babies because those babies need communication in order to grow and thrive. At the end of our lives, we need communication in order to remain healthy, especially mentally. In the meantime, one of the main reasons we communicate is to gain a desired response from our audience. Now, our audience can be one person or it can be several people, but every time we send a message, that's what we're trying to achieve. For example, if we say hello to somebody, we want hello back. If we ask a question, we want an answer. If we tell a joke, we want a laugh. So every time we send a message, we want a response back. So my question to you is, are you getting the responses that you want? And for the most part, you're probably thinking, well, I think so. But when you don't get the response that you want, think, oh, that's what she meant. I sent a message, I didn't get the response that I wanted. And frequently, when people don't get the response that they want, they blame the receiver of the message. They don't blame themselves. For example, I was in a comedy club, and most of the comedians that were performing were really bad. And it was a small room and a small audience, and nobody was laughing at their jokes. The comedians blamed the audience. They would make jokes like, is this microphone on? Or, folks, these are the jokes. And what I wanted to tell them is, if you were funny, we'd laugh, but you're not, so we're not. So that's what we end up doing a lot of times. When we don't get the response back that we want, we blame our audience. In order to be a more effective communicator, blame yourself first. Look at how you sent that message. Maybe that's what prevented you from getting the response that you wanted. So here's a quote about miscommunication by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. No one would talk much in society if they knew how often they misunderstood others. Well, here's my updated version of that quote. No one would talk much if they knew how often others misunderstood them. And because I work in communication, I do a lot of training and a lot of writing and reading about communication, I'm aware of all of the misunderstandings that happen on a regular basis in my life. A lot of times email is the culprit, misunderstandings because of email messages. But people misunderstand us all the time. And so I really do believe no one would talk much if they knew how often others misunderstood them. So know that people misunderstand you, but the good news is that there's something you can do about it. So we're going to look at things that impact our communication and that prevent us from getting the results that we want. Everything we are impacts our communication. And I've listed some, but this isn't the total list. We're going to go through the top 4 of these because that's all the time we have to do. And look at the different ways that we communicate based upon these types of factors. So the first thing we're looking at is our personality style. Now, there's lots of personality assessments out there, and one that I like to use is the DISC personality profile, D-I-S-C. That's just one. I also like to use Myers-Briggs personality profile. And what the DISC personality style does is put people into 4 different areas. A lot of personality styles do that. And so you might be familiar with different personality styles that put you in colors or animals or different types of things like that. So the DISC personality profile puts people in 4 categories, but the thing is that we don't fit nicely into a category. And so what we're going to be doing is generalizing. So people are a mixture of all 4 of these, but they tend to have a predominant style that is recognizable. And the reason that it's important that it's recognizable is that if we can tell what our predominant style is, we can figure out what we're doing that's preventing us from getting our needs met. Also, when we recognize the predominant style in others, we can figure out how they like to communicate. So most of us are familiar with the saying, treat people how you want to be treated. Well, there's a better saying, I think, and that is treat people how they want to be treated. When we communicate, we want people to communicate like us for the most part because it makes our communication simpler. And so if you can recognize how people like to communicate and modify your style certain degree in order to meet their style, you'll be more successful in having mutual understanding and at getting the results that you want. So let's take a look at that dominant personality style, the D. They're bold and direct, focusing on the big picture, tend to be competitive, aggressive, and ambitious. They get right to the point in their communication. They use as few words as they possibly can. And they may come across as forceful and intimidating to other people as a result of being so direct. They're concerned with achieving tasks and goals, and they want to achieve them as quickly as possible. And so that's why their communication is what it is because it's all directed to get people to move quickly so they can get those quick results. And sometimes they forget about the needs of the people carrying out the work because they're so task focused. They're unafraid of conflict and may seem overly stubborn in defending their ideas. So you might recognize a person that has a dominant personality style. Again, they're direct to the point. They tend to be loud. They come across as intimidating, aggressive, and that's what prevents them from getting the results that they want. Now, for the most part, they do get lots of results. They're very goal-oriented and they achieve lots of goals. But when they are in that dominant style that is not working for other people, this is the reason it's usually not working. They come across as impatient, blunt, poor listeners. Their communication usually is one way. Very impulsive, demanding. They can be insensitive to the feelings of other people. They may run over others who are slower to act or to speak. And so this is what happens. They seem pushy sometimes. And their directness is harsh sometimes and hurts the feelings of other people. So I like to give examples in my workshops. And the example I use for the dominant personality style is myself. I didn't know that I was a dominant personality style when this incident happened, but I soon learned that that's how I come across to other folks. So about 20 years ago, I had a coworker who trained with me, and I didn't feel that he was particularly good at training, and I wasn't the only one. Evaluations indicated as much. And the dominant personality style, very goal-oriented, achievement-driven, they hold themselves to a very high standard and everybody else as well. And when people don't meet that standard, they tend to just dismiss them and kind of delete them from existence. And so I had done that with my co-trainer, and he asked me one time, "Why don't you like me?" And my response was, "I don't like people I don't respect, and I don't respect you." Now, at that time, I didn't think anything about saying that. He asked me a question, I gave him an answer. Dominant personality styles tend to be very honest, brutally so. And so I didn't realize the impact that that would have on him. That sounds silly now, but back then it was just a question that was answered and move on to the next task. So it was pointed out to me after that fact that I was a dominant personality style, and that style sometimes prevented me from getting what I wanted. If you're talking to a dominant personality style, here's something to remember. They want you to speak the way that they speak. Very direct, to the point, say what you mean what you say, and get out of the way. They don't listen to people who are quiet and tentative and unconfident. And so if you want to get their attention and get the results for them, you need to mirror how they communicate. Next is the I, and that stands for initiator influencer. They're very animated, expressive, spirited people. They're a lot like the dominant personality style in that they're very high energy, except they value relationships. They want to be accepted, and they want personal prestige as well. So they like to get their pats on the back, just like the dominant does. They often speak quickly, using lots of gestures, lots of facial gestures, body language, hand gestures, and make it easily sidetracked onto another story altogether. So these are the folks who go off on tangents and can't remember what they were talking about in the first place. Great motivators because of their enthusiasm and are not afraid of conflict, but they don't like it. They enjoy a spirited discussion that involves a difference of opinion, but they don't like the conflicts where people end up not liking them. Because the thing with this personality style is they very much want people to like them. And that's why they communicate the way that they do, is that they're joking and they're storytellers and they're just fun people to be around. And they love to have a good audience that will appreciate their jokes and their stories. The downside of this style is they tend to be unrealistic because they're dreamers, not detail-oriented, so they make mistakes on their details, not having their facts exactly straight. Disorganized, impulsive, they listen to their feelings above logic, and so they make decisions with their heart instead of with their head. Tend to be reactive, especially when they feel that people disapprove of them. Can be too talkative for some personality styles, and very excitable. And so sometimes that excitability is almost a little manic sometimes. So my example on this personality profile is a good friend of mine who leads an organization. Great storyteller, great joker, but that's what presents a problem sometimes for this style, is that they joke so much that people don't think that they're serious when they actually are serious. And my friend was telling me about a conversation he was having with a subordinate, and he was saying to the subordinate that something bad had happened. And the subordinate said, "You're joking." He said, "No, it really did happen." "You're joking." "No, it really did happen." And this went on for about 15 minutes before the subordinate finally realized my friend was not joking. Why did it take 15 minutes? Because my friend's always joking. And so that's what prevents the style from getting what they want sometimes, is that people don't take them seriously. Or they tend to be too dramatic sometimes for other people. Their energy level is too high. They talk too much for some other folks. And so all of these things sometimes prevents them from getting the results that they want. Now, if you are talking to an initiator influencer, again, mirror their style. And so perhaps you might need to bring your energy level up. You might need to have more facial expressions. You might need to talk a little bit more. But they want people to be excited about things. And so if you show a little bit of excitement, then usually you're able to match their style. Now, if you are thinking, yeah, but I'm not high energy, I'm not expressive, I'm not all of these things, and so if I act that way, aren't I being fake? No, we all have an initiator influencer in us. Some of us just need to bring it out a little bit more. And so it's not being fake. Fake is when you're lying to somebody. In my book, fake is when you say something like, oh, I think that's great, when you really don't. Or I think that person's fabulous, when you really don't. But when you are flexing your style, you're just calling upon attributes and characteristics that you already have inside you. It's so that you just don't use them as much as you do other ones. But once you bring them up, it is easier to do so and to match people's style. The next personality style is the steady satisfier. And they're a lot like the initiator influencer in that they're people oriented. It's about people first and task second. It's not that the task is not important. It's just that the people are more important. But unlike the initiator influencer, they are quieter. They like to be behind the scenes more so than in front of an audience especially. So they're considerate and sympathetic. They're focused on people and interpersonal relationships, and they want very much for everybody to get along and for there not to be any tension or disagreement. They pick up on tension very quickly. They feel it much more than some of the other styles do. Wonderful team players because they love to help people, and that's how they please people, is by helping them do things. They're great listeners, always willing to help. However, their desire to keep everyone happy may sometimes interfere with getting the job done. And that's one of the things I hear steady satisfiers say sometimes, is that they are doing so much for other people that they can't get their own work done. Well, one of my favorite quotes is by Eleanor Roosevelt. She said, "No one can take advantage of you without your consent." And so that's one of the things that steady satisfiers who complain that they can't get their work done because they're helping other people need to keep in mind. They don't like conflict and will try to mollify the people involved and smooth over issues. They'll pretend that they're not unhappy, that there is no conflict, in order to keep everyone else happy. They sacrifice their own happiness for other people. And so that's that steady satisfier. Now, things that prevent them from getting the response that they want include that they tend to be indecisive. And so that doesn't work for some folks. Over-accommodating, may sacrifice results for the sake of harmony, slow to initiate action, avoid confrontation even when a confrontation is necessary, tend to hold grudges and remember hurts inflicted by others, and they don't like change. So I am good friends with a steady satisfier, and we work out together at a gym on Saturday and Sunday mornings. And on Sunday mornings, we get there just as soon as the gym opens so that we can get our workout in, because then we've got other things that we need to get accomplished. And the young woman who opens the gym on Sunday mornings is frequently late. And so that cuts into our workout time, and it's a bit frustrating for us. So one Saturday, we were working out at the gym talking about, I wonder if she'll be here on time tomorrow. And that young woman who opens the gym on Sunday mornings just happened to be working that Saturday. And so we said to ourselves, we should really talk to her and tell her how important it is for her to be here on time so that we can get our workout in. And my friend said, I'll say something to her. Now, I was amazed by that because my friend hates conflict. And she is so tactful and polite with people. She just hates to cause anyone to be unhappy at all. So I was really pleased that she said she was going to handle the situation. I figured that she's been hanging out with me long enough that maybe some of my dominance rode off on her. And so she was going to tell this young woman she needs to be at work on time. So we were walking out of the gym, and I was following my friend, and the young woman was behind the counter. And as we passed her, my friend said to her, "See you tomorrow." And then we walked out the door. Well, I wasn't surprised by that. I figured my friend caved in and she was not willing to say anything after all, and that was okay. But when we got outside, my friend said to me, "I bet she'll be to work on time tomorrow." And I said, "Really? Why do you think that?" And she said, "Because I told her we'd see her tomorrow." That was her way of telling the young woman to get to work on time. So that's what steady satisfiers do sometimes that prevent themselves from getting the results that they want. They are so polite, so tactful, so indirect that sometimes people don't know what they're saying. And then they wonder why nobody listens to them. And so what steady satisfiers can do to get better results from people, for the most part, is be a little bit more direct with them. But what other styles can do in order to be effective with steady satisfiers is to be polite and tactful and sympathetic and helpful and follow the social rules that we are all supposed to follow. Steady satisfiers tend to not like it when people don't say good morning or goodbye or please or thank you. They're the ones who follow these social rules that we were taught as children, and they don't like it when people don't follow those rules. The unfortunate thing is that most of the time other people don't know that they don't like it, because steady satisfiers wear a mask that hides their real feelings until they get pushed and pushed and pushed, and then they come out with guns blazing, and then you know exactly how they feel. But they have to get pushed to that point before they finally do it. If you're a steady satisfier, here's my advice for you. Don't let yourself get pushed to that point. It's not good for you. And then finally, we have our conscientious critic. Now, these folks are like steady satisfiers in that they like things at a slower pace. They like things well thought out and organized, well structured, planned, all of that. But they differ from each other in that the conscientious critic is much more task oriented than the steady satisfier. Steady satisfier is concerned about people. Conscientious critic concerned about getting the task done, like that dominant personality style. But the thing is that they tackle the task differently than the dominant personality style does. The dominant wants to get it done as quickly as possible, and the critic wants to get it done as accurately as possible. So they take their time to make sure that they get it done right the first time. So they're technical and systematic. They like things that are step by step, methodical, in order. They value logic, thoroughness, and precision. And so they tend to be perfectionist as a result of liking precision so much. They tend to be very detail-oriented because of that thoroughness. They tend to focus on facts and technical details while communicating. And so a lot of times they don't talk a lot, but when they do talk, there's a whole lot of technical information. So these are the folks that if you ask them what time it is, they'll tell you how time began and spend time telling you how watches are made and time is calculated and all of that kind of stuff. So they don't chit-chat about personal stuff, but when you ask them a question about something that's interesting to them, when it's involved with technology, then that's where they'll communicate. They have a methodical way of approaching problems and tasks and work well independently. They are really happy when they can go into their office and close the door and not have any emails or any phone calls or any interruptions, work on one project all day long and get it completed. That's their idea of a perfect day. Very detail-oriented and value accuracy, as I said, and that valuing accuracy is they want to make sure that they're right, but when you're talking to them, you need to make sure that you're right as well. They're uncomfortable with conflict and feel that facts should take precedence over emotion. I had a critic in one of my workshops who said, "I do not understand how people get their feelings hurt at work. We're just dealing with facts and logic. How do people get their feelings hurt about that?" And so that's a critic, is that they don't understand a lot of times how feelings get hurt or why people should take exception to the fact that they're being told that they're doing something wrong. And that's one of the things that critics do very well, is telling people that they're doing something wrong. They're much too hard on themselves. They expect to be perfect. They're too critical of others because they expect others to be perfect. They're overly cautious, won't make decisions without all the facts, too picky, and ironically, they're overly sensitive when it comes to criticism of them. So these are things that prevent them from getting the results that they want from other people, is too nitpicky, too critical, and being too sensitive as well to others' critique. One of the things, again, they focus a lot on people following the rules and that there are proper ways to do things and improper ways to do things. And I am married to a critic, and it's very difficult for me to do things properly. For example, loading the dishwasher. And so I do not load the dishwasher any longer, because when I do, it is not done according to my critic's specifications. And he needs to let me know that it's been done improperly and go behind me and fix everything that I have done incorrectly. So that works for us. I just don't load the dishwasher anymore. But if you are trying to communicate with a critic, then the things that you need to focus on is making sure you have your facts straight, bringing the energy level down, bring expressiveness down and drama down, and have things in order and go through all of the details and know what you're talking about. Because if you don't present it that way, usually they will discount you as well, just like the dominant personality style does. So again, we don't fit nicely into a category. I wish that people did. It would make life a lot easier. But we tend to have a predominant style that comes out. If you just watch people, usually you can figure out what that predominant style is. And if you flex your style, not hugely, but just make tiny adjustments in how you communicate, you can usually get better results from people when their style is different than yours. One of the things to remember, in addition to that we don't fit nicely into a category, is that how we see ourselves is not always how other people see us. And if we know how other people see us, that gives us some idea of what we might be doing wrong that's preventing us from getting the results that we want. So when I first became acquainted with the DISC personality profile, I thought I was an initiator influencer. I'm fun, I'm joking, I'm storytelling, I'm high energy, I'm all of those things. But I had a number of people point out to me that I was more of a dominant personality style, that my directness sounds harsh at times, which hurts the feelings of some folks, that I'm pushy to the point of turning people off. And those are things that I did not see about myself. So how other people see you is more important for our purposes here, because we might not know what we are doing that's preventing us from getting the results that we want. So how do you find out how you come across to other people? Listen to what people tell you about yourself. And if you have a significant other, usually they're the best person to listen to. We usually don't want to listen to them because of the way they give us feedback, but people are giving us feedback all the time on how we communicate. We just need to be open to it. And when we're open to that feedback, usually in the form of criticism, it gives us some insight on what we can do in order to get better results from other folks. So that's just one of the things that impacts how we communicate. And one of the things I'd like to talk about quickly is just where we get our personality style. So researchers say half of it is nature and half of it is nurture. Our parents pass on their DNA to us, and so we get a lot of our characteristics that way. And so if people have ever told you you're just like your father, well, you probably are, because he passed his DNA down to you. But then the other thing is that nurture, how we grew up, who raised us, where we were raised, when we were raised. And one of the things that I really like is who we were raised with. So there's a great theory called the birth order theory. And it says that where you are in the lineup of your siblings determines a large part of your personality style. And so your oldest children tend to be bossy, and youngest children tend to be spoiled, and middle children tend to go off on their own and be the peacemakers. Only children tend to be young adults. And so we have these characteristics as well. But one of the things that impacts us as far as our siblings are concerned is not only where we fall in the lineup, but who came before us, who came after us, what sex they are in comparison to what sex we are, how many of each sex there are, and how far apart we are. And so one of the things that I really subscribe to, because in reading this book called the Birth Order Theory book, which is conveniently easy to remember, it described my family perfectly. And I am the youngest child, and I'm the only girl. And so I see, because of being in that lineup and because of being the only girl, how that impacted my personality style. And so if you're interested, the Birth Order Theory book is easy to find, and it can give you some insight not only into your own personality style, but also if you're raising children, some things that you might need to consider in order to help them develop. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is gender. And I love this little cartoon. If you were my husband, I'd poison your coffee. If you were my wife, I'd drink it. Yeah, we've got a difficulty communicating with people of the opposite sex. Now, just like in our personality style, how we did not fall neatly into a category, we don't fall neatly into gender either. So we can't say that all men communicate a certain way and all women communicate a certain way. That just doesn't work, and we all know that. But there is more of a masculine style, and there's more of a feminine style. And some women communicate in more of a masculine style. I am one of those. And some men communicate more in a feminine style. And so sexual orientation doesn't have anything to do with it for the most part, or it doesn't have to. It is just the personality style we have that lends itself to whether we have more of a masculine style or a feminine style. So according to gender communication research, and there's some great books out there on gender communication. I highly recommend them. So the thing that the theory says is that the reason we communicate differently is that for millions of years or thousands of years, depending upon which theory you subscribe to, men have had one role and women have had another role. And men have been the protectors and the providers, and women have been the nurturers. And so our brains developed differently. And lots of folks have done MRIs on men's brains versus women's brains and have determined that they are in fact different. Men's brains are larger than women's brains. Women's brains have more gray matter than men's brains. So make of that what you will. And something that connects our two hemispheres is called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum in women's brains is thicker and has more nerve endings in it. So just biologically or physiologically, our brains are different. And so thus the theory is that we communicate differently. And sometimes that communication difference causes conflict. So we'll just go through some of these. I have lots and lots of lists on differences, but just for the sake of our time constraints, I'll just go through some. So men, or the masculine style, tends to communicate in order to demonstrate competence. And if you're a protector and a provider, you need to be competent so that people will want you to protect and provide for them. And a feminine purpose for communication is more of a connection. So it's not that women don't want to appear competent, but that's usually not the reason for the communication. So I'll give you an example. Once upon a time, I worked in an organization, and I was in my office one day, and I had two male colleagues standing outside of my office, and they were talking about fantasy football. I don't get fantasy football. I don't get why people spend hours and hours watching football on television, but That was their deal. So they're talking about fantasy football, and they're going back and forth about statistics and players and teams and who won what, and kept contradicting each other and correcting each other. And after about 15 minutes, I just thought, this is the stupidest conversation I've ever heard. And so I grabbed my purse to go off to lunch so I didn't have to listen to that conversation anymore. But I needed to stop and talk to a female coworker on my way out the door. And so I stopped to talk, and we conducted our business. And then she said to me, "That's a really cute purse." And I said, "Yeah, I had a really difficult time finding a Navy purse this year." And she said, "I did too. I finally had to go to LA." And I said, "Where did you go?" And we ended up having a 15-minute conversation about my Navy purse outside of the office of one of our male colleagues. And he was probably inside going, "That's the stupidest conversation I've ever heard." So the conversation about the blue purse was just a way of connecting us. And we enjoyed being connected for that brief period of time. Now, it's not that men don't like being connected and women don't like being competent. But again, these differences in topics that are worthy of our communication cause conflict sometimes. So more of a masculine way of communicating is making statements as fact, where more of a feminine way is qualifying statements. So a man may make a statement such as, "This is what we should do," where a woman might say, "I think this is what we should do, but that's only my opinion." Now, it's not that all women communicate that way, but I certainly have seen some. I had a woman in one of my workshops once who every time she said something would say, "That's just my opinion. That's just my opinion." And so that was a perfect example of how some women tend to communicate. So what is the problem here? Well, that "it's just my opinion" is just my opinion might make some women look incompetent, and that doesn't work for men. And men saying, "This is what we should do," sometimes seems as too bossy, which doesn't work for women. Men tend to be more direct, women tend to be more indirect. Now, as a dominant personality style, I'm pretty direct, but I find sometimes when I get around men that I fall into indirectness as well. So I was sitting under the fan at home, and I said to my husband, "I'm cold." And he said, "Do you want me to turn the fan off?" I said, "Yeah, I would." He said, "Why didn't you just say to turn the fan off?" Well, because directness sometimes sounds pushy or bossy, and we don't get the results that we want. So the theory goes that women have learned to be indirect in order to not have to make demands on what they want, because that result doesn't get them, or that tactic doesn't get them the results that they need. Men's directness sometimes doesn't work well for them. I said to my husband one time, "I'm fat." He said, "You're not that fat." So a little too direct for my taste. All right, so here's the one that's almost a cliche that most people know. Men tend to be problem solvers. Women tend to want to vent and want validation. And so this gets us in trouble sometimes, because when women vent, men try to solve their problem, and that's not what they want. They want validation more than anything else, that we are absolutely right to feel that way. So again, my husband got himself in a little bit of trouble being the problem solver. That comes naturally to him. I came home from work and he asked me how my day was, and I said I had a little bit of a problem. I had gotten a call from a client who said I was supposed to be at their workplace conducting a workshop at that moment. And I said, "No, I've got you scheduled for Thursday." And they said, "No, we said today." And so I went back and looked through my emails and found out they were right. I had got the wrong date. And so I said, I was concerned about that. And my husband's response was, "Well, you need to fix that. That's poor client service." Now, I know that's poor client service. I know I need to fix it. But he just couldn't help himself. So I wandered away, and he came after me, and he said, "I know that wasn't the right response. The right response was, 'Are you okay? Because you never do stuff like that.'" But he had responded the way it came naturally to him to solve that problem. And he also responded out of a little bit of fear, because he thought, "Oh no, she's losing her mind." And I thought I was losing my mind too, and that's why I wanted sympathy and validation. So that's how we get ourselves in trouble sometimes. Men tend to make low eye contact, women tend to make high eye contact. And so a lot of times, if men are not making eye contact with us, we think that they're not listening. And sometimes they're not. But this has been very helpful for me when I'm conducting workshops, and I have a lot of men in my workshops and they don't make eye contact with me. And I have learned that sometimes men feel uncomfortable making so much eye contact. And then another thing is that sometimes they need to look at something else in order to help them hear. And I worked with a male colleague once. When anyone was talking to him, he would look at the floor. And when he was talking, he could maintain eye contact. But in order to listen, he needed to look at something else. And so that presents some problems sometimes. Men tend to be more comfortable giving information. Women tend to be comfortable asking questions. And so these questions sometimes can appear to be interrogating or questioning competence. A male colleague said to me one time, we're going to be making the following change. And I said, really? Why? And he said, trust me, I know what I'm talking about. I did trust him. I was just asking for more information. But that's one of the things that I learned is sometimes questioning sounds like you're questioning competence. Now, on the other hand, if men would provide more information, we wouldn't have to ask so many questions, right? My husband got off the phone and he said, that was Mark. Lynn just had her baby. And I said, really? What did she have? He said, I don't know. He couldn't even find out if it was boy or girl. That was just too much information. And then finally, men tend to be quiet listeners and women tend to be verbal listeners. And so again, this is one of the things that makes women sometimes think that men aren't listening is because they're not giving them affirmation like women tend to do. So I was on a sales call with a couple of female coworkers, and one was a very verbal listener. And so we were doing a sales presentation to a man, and while he was talking, my coworker was listening like this. Yeah, I know. Me too. And finally, he stopped and he said, if you don't stop interrupting me, this meeting is over. Now, we were flabbergasted. We were so offended. What a jerk. But since then, I learned that verbal listening sometimes sounds as if you're interrupting and talking over people. And so maybe he was a jerk, maybe he wasn't, but what he was doing was providing very good feedback that communication was not working well for him. So these are some of the things that prevents us from being able to get our desired response sometimes is that we communicate differently. And so how do you flex? Well, the things that I have learned is that when I'm communicating with men, if I communicate more like a man, I tend to get better results. And so things that I have learned to do that are not on this list is not taking things so personally, because sometimes that's what women do. Not getting so emotional, not bringing things up that happened a year ago, laughing at jokes that are at my expense, all of these things. And how did I know to do this? Because of the feedback that I received from male colleagues. And the feedback was not, hey, Robin, you might try this. The feedback was, why are you taking things so personally? Why are you getting so emotional about this? Why can't you laugh at this? Why are you bringing this up again? And so all of that, very good feedback to tell me this is how they wanted me to communicate with them. Now, I'm not the only one who's having to do all of the work, but one of the things that we have to understand is that if we have information on how to flex and the other person doesn't, then we need to flex, and we need to share that information with them in the form of this. Could you perhaps be more sensitive when you're giving me feedback? Could you realize that people take things personally? Could you not tell jokes at my expense? And so this is our way of letting people know what they're doing that doesn't work for us. And we want to do so in a way that inspires them to want to communicate the way that we want them to. One of the things that impacts our communication is age differences. And I have 4 different generations here. There's actually 5 generations in the workplace now. And so I need to update my list here. But the folks that are at the top of the list, veterans, traditionalists, they're also called the greatest generation. And these folks, some of them at the very end of this generation are still at work. 70 years old or older and still working. And this style grew up in, or this generation grew up at a very different time than the rest of us who are not in that generation. They were going through World War II and the Depression, and if they weren't old enough to remember it, they got the remnants of the folks who were old enough to remember it. And so they tend to be more formal in their communication. And they don't particularly like slang too much. They hear disrespect when people are informal with them. So, for example, my mom is of this generation, and when we go out to eat, she hears disrespect when she says thank you, and the response is no problem. So that doesn't work for her. This generation prefers face-to-face or written communication. They'll pick up the phone if they have to, but usually they don't like that either. They are usually not on board with electronic communication. Some of them are, but some of them are not, and that presents a problem for folks who forget that. So my mom and I are in a book study club, and most of the communication is done through email or texting. And I had to remind the facilitator of our club, my mom doesn't email and she doesn't text. And so if you need to send a message to her, you're going to need to call her. And she might remember to listen to her answering machine if she's not there. And so that's that that generation. Boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, and those of us born between 1960 and 1964 are called Generation Jones. I was not happy to hear that Generation Jones folks, there's more of us in gel than any other generation. I don't know what it was about being born in the 60s, but that's what happened. So with this generation, and this is the largest generation in the workplace right now, that 30% of the workforce is this generation, whereas 8% of the workforce is the previous generation. But with this generation, they're more open and direct. I mean, these were the folks that were involved with social protest and social movements, and so they really value teamwork, and they were the folks that witnessed Nixon having to resign from office, and so they question authority, and they are the ones who started it. They're still more comfortable with face-to-face communication, and I am a witness to that. I finally got an iPhone a couple of months ago because I needed Google Maps, and I kept getting lost in foreign cities. And so still, they value face-to-face communication more than technology, although some have gotten on board with it. Generation X, more of an informal style, prefer electronic communication. And those are the ones who were at the forefront of watching all of the change in technology and jumped right on board with it and embraced it. And then Generation Y, and some people call them nexters or millennials, and they grew up on electronic communication and so are very savvy with it and appreciate it more so than face-to-face communication. Face-to-face to them takes too much time, and time is of the essence, and things need to go very quickly. And so electronic communication tends to work best for them. Now, we have problems with our communication with different generations. And so I've stated some of them is that some folks, if you're not communicating electronically, no one's communicating with you. And other folks take exception to communication electronically. I have a niece who sent me an invitation to her son's birthday party through email. And I replied, I can't read this. What are you sending me? And she said, it's an invitation. And I said, well, please send me one through the mail. Well, she never did. And I forgot all about the invitation to the birthday party. And so I didn't show up, and her feelings were hurt. And my thought was, if you really want me to be there, send me an invitation through the mail like you're supposed to. And that's some of the problems we have with our communication. So what can we do about this? Well, you don't need to jump on board with emailing or texting if you don't want to, and you don't have to send invitations through the mail if you don't want to. Just realize that age impacts how we like to communicate. And if you want to get better results from people of different ages, perhaps you should change your style to meet theirs. And the last thing we'll look at is culture. Now, what is culture? It's the norms, what is considered normal behavior, the norms, values, and traditions that a group of people share, including appropriate ways of communicating. So one of the things that people tend to think is that culture is perhaps our race or our religion. Well, culture also just includes how we were raised and if we get on board with how people raised us. So frequently people do, because they say, well, I was raised the following way, and if that was good enough for me, that's good enough for my kids. But one of the things also is that people don't understand sometimes is that they're taught how to communicate through their culture. So an example is if your parents said, look at me when I'm talking to you, then they just told you that you're supposed to make eye contact when you're communicating. And that becomes a problem when you're communicating with somebody who was taught differently. And that's what happened to me once. I was conducting a workshop and it was 3 hours long, and I had an Asian young woman in my class, and she didn't look at me the entire time I was conducting the workshop. And I thought, wow, she just really doesn't like what's going on here. Didn't participate at all. And so again, I just thought, man, if she's not talking, then she just doesn't care what's happening here. This is just misery and torture for her. So after the workshop, I said to her, is everything okay? And she said, well, yes. Why would you think it's not? And I said, well, you didn't look at me during the entire workshop. And she said, well, in my country, you don't look at people who are in positions of authority. She said, you are the revered teacher, and I am the student, and students don't look at the revered teacher as a sign of respect. So that's what happens sometimes. And by the way, I want to be called revered teacher from now on. So if any of you are interacting with me, that's the way to do it. So it has been observed that a diverse workforce can be a strategic organizational asset. Yes, because diversity brings different perspectives, which usually helps people generate more ideas that are better for the organization. However, very different people tend to engage in very intense conflicts, which can become an organizational liability. Culture has a huge impact on our communication, and we don't even recognize it. And we're having little culture clashes with people, and we don't even know that's what's happening. And so what can we do here? Well, it's just to appreciate the fact that if people are communicating differently than you, it makes sense to them. And that instead of thinking that it's wrong, because that's what we tend to do, we tend to think that our way of communicating is the correct way of communicating. Instead of thinking the way they communicate is wrong, we might ask more questions about why they communicate the way that they do. And if we're uncomfortable with that, just recognize the fact that people are behaving in a way that totally makes sense to them, and just like we communicate in a way that totally makes sense to us. So how do we become better communicators? Well, first of all, know yourself. In order to ensure our communication style is helping rather than hindering our relationships, we need to reflect on our own behavior. So I gave you just very brief descriptions of generalities about personality styles and gender, age, culture, all of that, but dig deeper into how you come across to other people. So taking assessments like the DISC questionnaire or the Myers-Briggs personality profile is a good start, but just ask yourself questions. How much do I talk? Do I talk too much? Now, how would you know? By looking around a room when you're talking to see if people feel overwhelmed, if they're looking at their watch, if they're looking down, if they're looking away from you. Do you talk too little? How would you know that? Because people are asking lots of questions of you, or they're just not interacting with you that much. How frequently do I interrupt others? That's one thing. A couple of personality styles are interrupters, and that presents a problem for other people. And so listen to yourself when you're interacting with other people to see if you're interrupting them. What does my body posture say to people? Do you slouch? Do you stand up straight? And that definitely is communicating things to people. What do my facial expressions say? And one of the things, people usually are oblivious of what their facial expressions are saying. One of the things that I strongly encourage people to think about when people are talking to them is what their nonverbal communication is saying. Because we react sometimes with our face when we don't even know that we're reacting. And our response will encourage people to communicate with us or will encourage them not to communicate with us. And so be aware of what your facial expression is saying, especially when you're listening to people. Do you welcome feedback? So when people tell you, why do you have to be so sensitive? Or why do you take things personally? Do you just shut that out? Or do you think of that as, oh, this is good feedback. Thank you for letting me know that. How do you let others know what your needs are? If you're communicating in a way that is not inspiring people to meet your needs, then they won't. For example, I used to have a grandma who would say, you never come visit. You always used to come visit, but now you don't come visit. Why don't you ever come visit? Well, what she was telling me was, I would like for you to visit because I'm lonely. I miss you. But the way she communicated it did not inspire me to go visit. So how do you let others know what your needs are? Do you always have to be right? Do you always have to have the last word? Then probably people aren't going to want to hang out with you too much. Are your feelings and your behavior congruent? Do they match? Are you expressing on the outside what you're feeling on the inside? Then know your audience. Who are you talking to? So you want to remember the reason for communication, and that's to get the result that you want. And so tailor your message for your audience, and that's why you need to know who they are. So if your audience is dominant personality style, maybe you need to flex a little bit. If your audience is a male and you're female, maybe you need to flex a little bit. If your audience is older than you or younger than you, maybe you need to flex a little bit. So know who you're talking to, know how they like to communicate, and tailor your message for your audience. And then finally, check for understanding. And this is the most difficult part of the entire process, in my opinion. How do you know that people know what you have said? Well, certainly watch their facial expression to see if it looks like things are registering with them. But don't ask them, do you understand? Or do you have any questions? Because those are closed questions. And usually when you say, do you understand? They say yes. Do you have any questions? No. And that's the end of it. So how do you make sure they understand? Well, one of the things you can do is have them repeat back. You don't always want to do that because it makes people feel silly. But sometimes you can just say, I just want to make sure I gave you that list in order. So can you just tell me what I told you? Or ask them open-ended questions. How do you feel about what I just said? What are your thoughts? What are you going to do next? What are the biggest problems you think you'll have with this? And so get them talking back to you, and you can usually tell whether you have mutual understanding of the message. Also, check back in with them shortly after you sent that message. If you've given them a task to do, check back in quickly after to ensure they're on the right path. Chances are you don't have mutual understanding of the message, and so make sure frequently that you do so that you don't have an unpleasant surprise down the road. So typical two-way communication is what the speaker thinks he said, what he actually said, and what the listener thinks he said. We don't always say what we think we're saying. And then the listener puts their own little twist and turn on it. And so that's why we need to diligently make sure that we're listening to ourselves and that the listener has heard what we've intended. Communication works for those who work at it. Is it work? Yeah, it is. Flexing and ensuring understanding and all of that takes some work because it takes energy and it takes thought. But the way we communicate with others and with ourselves ultimately determines the quality of our lives. I believe that to be true. So I think the work is worth it. I know that my life has been enhanced tremendously since I found this information and have used these techniques. And I hope that your life is better as a result of tuning into our webinar today. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.